Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now, let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The morning sun filtered through the half-drawn blinds, casting a soft gold hue across the quiet kitchen where Kenneth stood, carefully arranging toasted bread and fruit slices into Chimamanda's favorite cartoon face. It was the little things now, the ones he never used to think about, that gave him the most joy. He glanced at the school lunch bag already packed and the soft pink bow Chimamanda had insisted on wearing today. She skipped into the room barefoot, her laughter so free it startled him. This was not the child who used to flinch at footsteps. This was not the girl who whispered apologies for existing. This was Chimamanda, his daughter, whole and rising again from the silence Vanessa had buried her in. As he poured her orange juice and she told him about the poem she was learning at school, Kenneth felt something shift in him. He wasn't just rebuilding her life. He was finally living his. The drive to school was filled with music, off-key singing, and the occasional wave at familiar faces in the neighborhood. Kenneth had begun walking her to the school gate himself, something he hadn't done in years. Parents watched with a mix of admiration and curiosity. Many remembered Vanessa's poised elegance and how untouchable she had seemed. Yet here was Kenneth, sleeves rolled up, holding his daughter's hand like it was a lifeline. "Bye, Daddy," Chimamanda shouted, running into her classroom. He smiled, knowing Miss Amaka would be inside. There was something comforting about knowing that woman was in his daughter's world, someone who had seen what he hadn't, someone who had spoken when he remained blind. Their paths crossed briefly at the gate. Amaka smiled, and Kenneth nodded, a silent exchange of gratitude passing between them. At work, Kenneth sat behind his desk, but found himself staring out the window more often than not. The files remained untouched longer than they should, his mind drifting back to breakfast, to Chimamanda's giggle, to Amaka's eyes soft, but tired. He wondered what she looked like when she wasn't being strong. Did she have someone to make her laugh when the day grew heavy? Did she go home to a place that felt safe? Something inside him stirred, not out of pity, but out of quiet concern. He realized that in saving his daughter, Amaka had poured pieces of herself into both of them. The least he could do was make sure she never had to carry it alone. Chimamanda ran up to Miss Amaka during break time, beaming with the type of excitement only a child who had tasted peace could carry. "My daddy made me laugh so hard today," she announced. "He made smiley faces with my toast." Amaka chuckled, kneeling to straighten the girl's collar. "That's because your daddy loves you," she said gently. But as Chimamanda ran off to join her classmates, Amaka's smile faltered. Her own childhood had no such memories. Her father was strict and absent, her mother long gone. And Tchuku, the man she shared her present with, only ever brought silence and bruises. Watching Chimamanda glow made her ache, not out of envy, but longing. The kind of longing that comes when you know what love should look like, but have only tasted its counterfeit. And still, she reminded herself, some people carry light even while living in the dark. That afternoon, Kenneth surprised the class with a visit during their poetry showcase. The children squealed when he walked in with cupcakes and a shy smile. Amaka's breath caught in her throat, not because of his presence, but the way his eyes immediately sought out Chimamanda. He sat in the back as his daughter took the stage, reciting a poem about rainbows and safe places. Halfway through, Chimamanda turned to her teacher and said, "This is for my daddy and my teacher who helped me smile again." The class clapped, but Amaka's hand trembled over her chest. Kenneth approached afterward, smiling. "Thank you for everything," he said. "No one has ever noticed her the way you did." Amaka smiled in return, but the gratitude in his eyes held something deeper. And for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder what that something could be. Later that evening, as Amaka walked home with a bag of groceries, she let herself hum quietly. The poetry event had been beautiful. Chimamanda's words had filled her with hope, and Kenneth's quiet kindness had warmed something she thought long dead. She unlocked the door to her small flat and stepped in. The smile she wore instantly faded. Sitting on the couch, arms folded, eyes cold and waiting, was Tchuku. "You didn't tell me you were hosting men in your class," he he said, voice laced with venom. Don't lie. One of the PTA mothers told me he was there, and that he was looking at you. Amaka froze, her palms going clammy. The humming in her mind was replaced by the dull roar of fear. It was for the children, she whispered. He's Chimamanda's father. Tchuku stood up slowly, his towering frame blocking her path. And now he's yours too, he growled. The peace from earlier died in her throat. Tchuku's hand didn't reach her face that night, but his words did far worse damage. You're getting too soft, Amaka. You're forgetting who gave you this life. He took her phone, as he often did, and scanned it for messages. He sneered at the voiced note from Kenneth. This man, he thinks he can steal what belongs to me. She didn't answer. She'd learned long ago that silence was her best defense. When he was done insulting her, he locked the door behind him and left with her phone. Amaka sat on the edge of her bed, her hands shaking. This wasn't new. It was just escalating. She should leave. She should run. But the fear of not having anywhere to go, of the shame that would follow her if word got out, it all felt heavier than her bruises. She tried to hold onto the memory of Chimamanda's smile, the way Kenneth looked at his daughter like she was sacred. That kind of love, safe, patient, visible. It made her feel something unfamiliar, worthy. And that terrified her even more than Tchuku. Because when you start to believe you deserve more, the pain you tolerate becomes unbearable. That week, she returned to school wearing long sleeves despite the heat. Kenneth noticed. Are you okay? He asked softly. She nodded too quickly. Just tired. He didn't press, but his eyes lingered. Amaka knew it was only a matter of time before Kenneth, observant, steady Kenneth, connected the dots. And if he did, would she be strong enough to tell him the truth? On Friday, Chimamanda handed her a hand-drawn picture during lunch break. It showed 3 stick figures. One was clearly her, the other was Kenneth, and in the middle was Amaka with a crown. You're my fairy teacher, she said proudly. You fix me. Amaka's throat tightened. No one had ever described her as someone who fixed things. She often felt like she was the one broken. But here was a child, brave and once silenced, telling her she mattered. That evening, when Tchuku returned from work and barked at her to serve his food, Amaka moved slower than usual. When he raised his voice, she did not flinch. Deep inside her, behind the cracked ribs of fear, a small flame had been lit. And whether it burned her or freed her, she was no longer afraid to feel it. The Monday after the poetry showcase, Amaka stood in front of her mirror, dabbing a little concealer under her left eye. The bruise hadn't fully darkened yet. It was in that sickly yellow stage that signaled it had been festering quietly over the weekend. Tchuku hadn't hit her with the same force as before, but the pain in her heart seemed deeper, more personal this time. His accusations had changed tone. They weren't just jealous rants anymore, they were paranoid warnings. He's making you forget who you are, he'd muttered in the dark. The mirror didn't lie. She looked tired, aged, worn out in places that had no physical wounds. As she adjusted her scarf and applied lip balm, she whispered to herself, You're still here, you're still standing. But her reflection only blinked, silent and sorrowful. The Amaka she saw wasn't the one who danced at the poetry showcase or hugged Chimamanda with light in her chest. This Amaka was surviving again, and survival, she realized, wasn't the same as living. In class, Chimamanda noticed instantly. She didn't ask questions like an adult would. She simply stared at her teacher's face with those big, knowing eyes. Amaka turned to the board, hiding her expression, and began the morning lesson with a quiet voice. But children are intuitive in ways adults underestimate. During lunch, Chimamanda slid her notebook toward Amaka. On the page was a sketch of a woman with stars in her hair and a tear sliding down her cheek. Beneath it, she had written, Even stars cry, but they still shine. Amaka felt her breath hitch. She gently folded the paper and placed it in her purse. When Kenneth arrived to pick up Chimamanda that day, his eyes briefly caught hers. There was something in his gaze, a question, maybe even a plea, but he said nothing. She appreciated his restraint, even if a part of her wished someone would press a little harder. That night, Tchuku returned home in a foul mood. He had gotten into an argument with one of his supervisors and needed a target to unleash his bitterness. "Your soup is watery," he barked after the first spoonful, slamming the spoon down. "Or maybe your mind is still on that man who brought cupcakes and clapped for you like a fool." Amaka stood by the wall, hands behind her. She didn't argue. Not anymore. Not when silence bought her fewer bruises. She waited for him to finish his tirade, then quietly cleared the table. But when he stepped close, finger pointing at her chest, something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear, not this time. "You think you're a queen now," he sneered. Amaka blinked slowly and turned away without answering. Deep in her chest, something small was cracking open. Not rebellion, not quite yet, but resistance. For the first time, she didn't flinch when the door slammed behind him. Chimamanda's birthday approached like a bloom in spring, delicate, colorful, and full of warmth. Kenneth had been planning it for weeks. He didn't want something grand, just a modest gathering of classmates, a few teachers, and family friends who'd stood by them during Vanessa's fallout. Amaka had been involved in the planning from the beginning. She helped design the party games, created handwritten invitation cards with Chimamanda, and even helped Kenneth choose a theme: butterflies and rainbows, symbols of growth and second chances. But the day before the party, Tchuku found the invitation card in her purse. His expression hardened as he stared at it. "So you've gone from teacher to party planner now?" he asked coldly. Amaka tried to explain, to remind him that it was for a child, an innocent child who saw her as safe, but he didn't want to hear it. "You step out that door tomorrow, and you'll come back to find it locked," he said. "Don't test me, Amaka." The next day, Amaka stared at the clock like it was a judge. Every second ticked, louder than the last. Her heart wanted to be at the party. Her mind screamed the consequences. Chimamanda had called her that morning to say she'd saved her a slice of cake and even written her a poem. Amaka wiped her tears silently. As the sun dipped into late afternoon, she made a decision that was both foolish and brave. She slipped out while Tchuku was asleep, careful not to leave the gate ajar. When she arrived at the party, it was already in full swing, balloons fluttering, music playing, and Chimamanda in a yellow dress twirling on the lawn. When she spotted Amaka at the gate, her scream of joy was deafening. Auntie Amaka came. Kenneth turned and smiled wide, but that smile faded as he noticed the tension on Amaka's face. She stayed only 30 minutes, enough to hug Chimamanda, drop off her gift, and quietly thank Kenneth. "I shouldn't have come," she whispered as she turned to leave. Kenneth didn't stop her. He only placed a firm hand on her shoulder and said, "You'll never be unwelcome here." By the time she returned home, Tchuku was waiting. The television was off. The house was silent. Her heart pounded. "You smell like party rice," he said as she entered. Was he there? Amaka didn't answer. She walked past him and entered the bedroom. He followed. The yelling began. "I told you not to embarrass me. I told you not to choose them over me." His fist didn't hit her face this time. It hit the wardrobe, inches from her head. The wall cracked. Her chest heaved, but her tears did not come. She wasn't crying anymore. He tried to reach for her phone, but she had left it at school, hidden beneath a stack of exercise books. That night, Amaka slept with one eye open and a plan starting to form in her mind. If he locked the door again, she'd climb the window. Tchuku's rage did not die with the night. In the morning, he refused to let her leave. "You want to be out there laughing with that man while I sit here like a fool," he spat. He took her keys and locked the main door from the outside. "No school for you today. You need to learn who you belong to." Amaka sat on the edge of the bed, fists clenched. The sun peeked through the curtains, taunting her with freedom just beyond her reach. Hours passed. She heard the neighbor's car start, school bells faint in the distance, and somewhere in the neighborhood, children shouting. The world continued, indifferent to her cage. She reached for her old school-issue tablet, one Tchuku never bothered to check. She opened Chimamanda's contact and typed, "Tell your dad I need help. Don't come. Just tell him quietly. Please." She hit send, shut the device off, and lay back down. Her body was still, but her soul was screaming. Back at school, Chimamanda checked her messages on a class break and saw Amaka's note. Her heart dropped. She ran straight to her father, interrupting his brief chat with another parent. "Daddy, Auntie Amaka is in trouble again," she whispered, tears welling up. Kenneth bent low, grabbed her shoulders, and asked, "What do you mean?" She handed him the tablet. One glance at the message, and Kenneth's entire demeanor shifted. Without explanation, he grabbed his car keys and stormed toward the gate. A school administrator followed, and by the time they reached Amaka's house, they found the door chained from outside. Kenneth pounded on it until Amaka's voice came through weakly. "I'm inside." Minutes later, a locksmith arrived. The door was opened, and Amaka emerged, eyes red, hair tousled, but unbroken. Kenneth pulled her into a protective embrace, saying nothing. She sobbed into his chest. The school administrator took note of the lock, took pictures, and promised to file a formal complaint. That night, Amaka stayed in a safe house arranged by the school's welfare office. Kenneth visited and brought her a change of clothes and Chimamanda's drawing from a poetry day. "We'll figure this out," he said softly. Amaka sat on the edge of the bed, her hand gripping the girl's drawing like it was scripture. "He's not going to stop," she whispered. "He's going to kill me one day." Kenneth took her hand gently and replied, "Then we stop him first." It wasn't just a promise, it was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. The silence that had protected Tchuku for so long would echo no more. It was time to speak. Chimamanda sat at the breakfast table, twirling a spoon between her fingers, staring at the oatmeal that had long since gone cold. Kenneth, preoccupied with emails on his phone, barely noticed until she finally spoke. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice almost inaudible, "do people who love others lock them inside?" The words caught him off guard. He put down the phone slowly and studied her face. There was no mischief in her eyes, only worry. "Why do you ask?" he inquired, feigning calm. Chimamanda shrugged, her gaze now fixed on the spoon. "Auntie Amaka, I think she doesn't want me to know, but she's not happy. And when people aren't happy, they flinch. Like I used to." Kenneth's chest tightened. She didn't say it to accuse or to gossip. She said it like a child who recognized pain in someone else because she had lived through it. He sat beside her, brushing his fingers through her hair. "Thank you for telling me, Mandy," he whispered. "You're very brave." After school, he lingered outside Amaka's classroom, pretending to look at the student art hanging in the corridor. She exited the room, arms full of books, her eyes hollow despite the small smile she gave him. "Can we talk?" he asked gently. Her smile faltered. "Kenneth, I don't want to get you involved." "Too late," he interrupted. "You already are." He led her to the bench under the tree near the gate, the same tree where Chimamanda used to sit alone. Amaka sat down, her shoulders visibly weighed by secrets. "He used to just shout," she began, her voice flat. "Then it became other things. Bruises, threats, taking my phone. Then he locked me in. It's escalating." Kenneth listened, rage slowly burning behind his otherwise calm expression. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because I didn't want to be rescued," she said bitterly. "I wanted to survive on my own. I thought I could handle it until I couldn't." She glanced at him. "But now I'm scared. Not just for me anymore. For Chimamanda. He knows she matters to me. That makes her vulnerable too." That night, Kenneth couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house felt like a warning. Every memory of Vanessa, of not seeing the signs, of missing Chimamanda's cries for help, flooded his mind like a storm. He walked into his daughter's room, watching her sleep peacefully. Her chest rose and fell in rhythmic grace, her arms wrapped around her worn teddy bear. He realized he couldn't afford to be passive ever again. This was not just about Amaka. This was about preventing history from repeating itself. It was about protecting a woman who had walked into his life and helped rebuild his daughter's world. More than anything, it was about honoring the vow he had silently made the day he saw Chimamanda kneeling on gravel, to never let pain grow unchecked under his roof again. As he stood there, he realized something else. Somewhere along the line, his gratitude for Amaka had grown into something else, something deeper. The next day, Kenneth drove to Amaka's compound. It was a quiet area with low fences and rusted gates, the kind of neighborhood where eyes stayed closed and mouths kept shut. He parked across the street, nerves thrumming. As he stepped out, he noticed children playing with sticks near a gutter and a woman hanging wet clothes on a sagging line. No one looked at him, but he could feel he didn't belong. The gate to Amaka's apartment was slightly ajar. He walked up and knocked gently. The curtain behind the window shifted, then stilled. Moments later, Amaka's voice floated through the iron bars. "Kenneth." He nodded. "Are you okay?" She opened the gate slowly. Her face was drawn, her hair untied, and there was an ugly red mark on her arm, barely hidden by a sweater. "Why are you here?" she whispered. "To check on you," he said, stepping inside. "I can't let this go on. Let me help you." Amaka shook her head. "He's inside. If he sees you—" Before she could finish, the door creaked open behind her. Tchuku stepped out. He was taller than Kenneth, darker-skinned, and his face bore the smug confidence of a man who thought himself untouchable. "Who the hell is this?" he asked, voice sharp. Kenneth stood his ground. "I'm Chimamanda's father, and her teacher is my friend. I came to make sure she's safe." Tchuku chuckled, low and menacing. "Safe?" he said mockingly. "She's in her own house, isn't she? What's unsafe about that?" His eyes flicked to Amaka. "You've been running your mouth, haven't you?" She looked away. Kenneth stepped forward. "If you lay another finger on her, I swear—" "You'll what?" Tchuku interrupted, suddenly animated. He stepped closer. "You think you can walk into my compound and threaten me? You don't know who I am." Kenneth didn't blink. "And you don't know what I'm willing to do to protect people I care about." Silence stretched between them like a loaded gun. Finally, Tchuku stepped back. "This is your only warning," he spat. "Don't come here again." Kenneth left the compound, but not before giving Amaka one last look, a promise, silent but heavy. "This isn't over." As he got into the car, his hands trembled, not from fear, but fury. He called his lawyer immediately and requested a meeting the following morning. Something had to be done. At home, Chimamanda ran to him with a school project. He hugged her tighter than usual. "You okay, Daddy?" she asked, confused. He nodded. "Yes, just tired." But deep inside, he was already planning. No woman should have to live in fear behind her own door. And no child should ever be collateral damage in another adult's war. He would fix this, not just for Amaka, but because this time he had a chance to be the protector he failed to be before. Amaka barely slept. After Kenneth left, Tchuku stormed through the apartment like a lion denied prey. He didn't hit her. Perhaps the presence of another man had shaken him, but his words were venomous. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said, pacing. "You forget who paid your rent, who gave you a life when your parents left you with nothing, who let you teach those snot-nosed brats instead of working as someone's housegirl." Amaka sat silently on the couch, arms folded, not answering. That silence, once her shield, had now become her quiet protest. "He's not coming here again," Tchuku growled. "And you're not leaving. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not until you remember your place." Then he did something worse than slapping. He took her house keys and left the apartment, locking her in from the outside. Trapped inside her own home, Amaka tried to stay calm. She drank water. She opened the window for air. She prayed. But panic clawed at her chest, and her thoughts raced. What if something happened to Chimamanda, and she couldn't be there? What if Tchuku came back angrier? She searched her bag for the school-issue tablet, one of the few things he hadn't confiscated. A sigh of relief escaped her when she found it beneath her lesson plan folders. Her fingers shook as she typed a message. "Mandy, tell your daddy I'm locked inside. Please don't come yourself. Just send help. Please." She hesitated before hitting send. What if Tchuku checked the tablet later? But she couldn't think about that now. She hit send, switched it off, and hid it beneath the mattress. Then she sat by the window and waited. Hours passed. Her bladder ached. Her stomach growled. Still she waited. When the knock finally came, she flinched. "Amaka." Kenneth's voice echoed through the door. "It's me. I brought someone with me." Tears filled her eyes. "I'm here," she called out. Minutes later, the lock was forced open. The door creaked, and light spilled in like freedom itself. Amaka didn't hesitate. She stepped out into Kenneth's arms and sobbed. The school administrator who had come along immediately took photos of the inside lock, the keys still missing. Kenneth guided her into the car, no questions asked. That evening, she stayed at a shelter provided by the school. It wasn't luxurious, a simple single room with a mattress on the floor, but she had a key. She had a phone. She had freedom. For the first time in years, she slept with the door locked from the inside, and not in fear, but in safety. The door creaked open, and Amaka stepped out into a reality that no longer shackled her in darkness. Kenneth stood at the threshold, framed by afternoon light, his jaw clenched and eyes scanning every inch of her. She hadn't realized how broken she looked until she saw his reaction. The bruises under her scarf, the swollen wrist she had tried to hide, the gauntness in her cheeks. For a long moment, they said nothing. He just reached out and took her hand, not as a rescuer, not as a savior, but as someone willing to walk beside her. Behind him, the school administrator quietly took photographs of the chained door, the broken lock, the furniture pushed against the wall like barricades. There was no shouting, no police sirens, only the quiet efficiency of people who understood that safety doesn't always arrive loudly. Kenneth guided her into his car like she was made of fragile glass, and Amaka, despite herself, leaned into the seat and exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for years. They drove in silence to the school's designated safe house, a modest flat usually reserved for emergencies involving students or at-risk staff. The walls were bare, the furniture was minimal, but Amaka felt something she hadn't felt in years: agency. She had her own bed, her own key, and a phone she didn't have to hide. Kenneth unpacked the small bag she brought along and gently placed Chimamanda's drawing on the bedside table. "She made that for you," he said quietly. Amaka sat down on the edge of the mattress, her fingers brushing over the crayon lines. Bold strokes, forming a woman with wings made of stars. The inscription read, "Auntie Amaka, my butterfly." Her lips trembled. "She sees me in ways I don't even see myself," she whispered. Kenneth knelt in front of her, meeting her eyes. "Because you gave her back her voice, Amaka. Now it's time we help you find yours again." The words didn't fix anything, but they wrapped around her like a warm blanket. They didn't feel performative. They felt earned, like something spoken from a place of deep, shared understanding. Later that evening, Chimamanda visited the safe house with a care package, a book of poetry, a small bottle of perfume, and a pink bracelet she made with beads. Amaka hugged her tightly, unable to stop the tears from falling. "You can be safe now, too," Chimamanda whispered in her ear. It wasn't said as a question or a hope. It was said as a statement of faith, a truth from one survivor to another. Kenneth watched the interaction from the corner of the room, arms folded, his eyes soft. He didn't interfere. He didn't try to make it about himself. He simply stood by and let healing happen in its own language. As Chimamanda skipped off to the car later that night, Kenneth turned to Amaka and said, "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure no one ever cages you again." And in the quiet of that promise, a corner of Amaka's heart, the one she had sealed shut long ago, finally dared to believe. It took several days for Amaka to feel like her lungs could truly expand. At the safe house, she cooked for herself, slept undisturbed, and learned to listen to silence without fearing what came next. Kenneth visited daily, sometimes with Chimamanda, sometimes alone, never demanding, never pressing. He brought her groceries, helped her contact the school board about time off, and sometimes just sat in the living room while she read or braided her hair. And slowly, Amaka began to open up. One evening, as the rain whispered against the window, she looked up from her tea and said, "I used to think love was supposed to hurt, that if someone wasn't angry, it meant they didn't care." Kenneth didn't interrupt. He waited. She continued, "My father was the same. Gentle in public, cruel in private. So when Tchuku started showing those signs, I thought maybe it was just me. Maybe I just wasn't lovable unless I was useful, obedient, or afraid." She placed her cup down, her hands trembling. I stayed because leaving felt like failure. I didn't want to be that woman who couldn't keep a man. I thought if I gave more, obeyed more, endured more, he'd change. Kenneth leaned forward. And when did you stop believing that? Amaka smiled bitterly. When Chimamanda told me I was her safe place. I realized I couldn't be anyone's sanctuary if I kept living in my own prison. Her voice cracked then, a wave of emotion breaking through. You know what hurts the most? She asked. It's not the bruises. It's the fact that I stopped recognizing myself. I became small, silent, hollow, just like I feared. But somehow this girl saw me. Your daughter saw me. And she made me remember who I used to be. Kenneth reached across the table and held her hand. Then let's rebuild that woman. One step at a time. That night, they sat side by side on the couch, sharing stories, not of pain, but of dreams. Amaka talked about how she used to want to write a children's book about bravery. Kenneth talked about his late wife, and how proud she would have been of Chimamanda. The conversation flowed like a quiet river, easing past the jagged rocks of the past. There was no romantic confession, no dramatic declarations, just two people who had weathered storms and were learning, gently, how to exist in the sun again. When Kenneth stood to leave, Amaka walked him to the door. He paused, then looked at her and said, You're not alone anymore. She nodded, tears shining in her eyes. Neither are you. The door closed behind him with a soft click, not a prison gate, but a promise of return. The next morning, as Kenneth arrived at Chimamanda's school for a parent-teacher committee meeting, the security guard handed him a folded note with no return name. Somebody dropped this at the gate early this morning, the guard explained. Kenneth took it, unfolded it, and immediately froze. Scrawled in red ink, or something that looked disturbingly like blood, were the words, You took what's mine. I'll take what's yours. There was no signature, no return address. But he didn't need one. His entire body stiffened with dread. Tchuku had sent a message, and it wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration of war. He immediately pulled Chimamanda out of class, informing the principal that she wouldn't return until further notice. Then he called his lawyer and arranged for an emergency meeting with the police. He knew now that this wasn't just about Amaka. It was about vengeance, about dominance. Tchuku wasn't going to stop until someone stopped him. Kenneth drove to the safe house, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When he arrived, Amaka opened the door with a smile that quickly faded the moment she saw his face. What happened? She asked, her voice shaky. He handed her the note. She read it once, then again, as her hands began to tremble. He wouldn't hurt Chimamanda, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Kenneth took her by the shoulders. He tried to lock you away, Amaka. He's unhinged. We can't underestimate him anymore. They sat down, their minds racing. We have to file a report, Amaka said. We have to show them this. It's not just me anymore, it's a child he's threatening. Kenneth nodded. We'll go together. She looked at him, fear still swimming in her eyes. What if the system doesn't listen? He took her hand. Then I'll make them. Later that afternoon, they visited the police station. A female officer with stern eyes and a soft voice took their statement. When Amaka showed her pictures of bruises, the voice recordings she had secretly gathered, and the threatening note, the officer grew silent. He's escalating, she said finally. And from my experience, men like this don't stop until something breaks. A door, a woman, a life. She promised swift action and arranged for extra patrols around Chimamanda's school and Kenneth's residence. That night, Amaka stayed with Kenneth and Chimamanda, the first time she'd ever slept in their home. As Chimamanda curled beside her on the bed, whispering, You're safe now, Amaka knew something had changed. Not just in her environment, but in her spirit. For the first time in years, she wasn't preparing to flee. She was preparing to fight. The next morning was still and unervingly bright, the kind of deceptive peace that often masks approaching storms. Kenneth had decided not to send Chimamanda to school for the week, keeping her close by while awaiting a court date and word from the authorities. Despite the outward calm, there was tension in the air. Amaka, now staying in the guest room, helped Chimamanda prepare breakfast. laughing softly when the girl spilled orange juice. But underneath the surface, Amaka's eyes kept darting toward the windows, and Kenneth's phone remained glued to his palm. Around midday, the housekeeper brought in a delivery package labeled under Kenneth's name. Inside were three things: a cracked picture frame of Kenneth and Chimamanda, a child's drawing of a smiling sun, torn in half, and a USB flash drive. On it was nothing but a black screen with bold red words, "I warned you." Amaka gasped. Chimamanda, sensing something was wrong, asked, "Daddy, what's going on?" Kenneth gently excused himself, locked the office door, and called the police. Later that day, as Chimamanda returned from a ballet rehearsal, her first time leaving the house all week, something fell off. The security vehicle that usually followed discreetly was suddenly called away to assist in another case. It was just a short walk from the car park to the school gate, but the absence of security in those few minutes proved costly. A man wearing a hat and sunglasses emerged from behind the compound fence and lunged forward, grabbing Chimamanda by the arm. "Where's your daddy now?" he spat, dragging her a few feet before a scream erupted from her throat. It was Tchuku. Her voice cracked through the silence like a lightning bolt. A teacher who was just leaving dropped her bag and rushed toward them, shouting. A passing vendor hurled a crate. Chimamanda's security detail returned just in time to wrestle Tchuku to the ground. Blood poured from his nose as the guards beat him and pinned him down. Chimamanda was shaking, sobbing uncontrollably, her dress torn, knees scraped. She didn't let go of the teacher's hand all the way to the hospital. Kenneth arrived at the emergency room, breathless and pale. Seeing Chimamanda bandaged, sobbing into Amaka's chest, shattered him. His mind couldn't comprehend the image of his daughter, his only child, being preyed upon by a man so evil, so calculated. He collapsed onto the hospital bench outside the ward, burying his face in his palms. Amaka sat beside him, tears falling down her cheeks. "I didn't know. I didn't think he would go this far," she whispered. "This is my fault." Kenneth turned to her, voice hoarse. "No, it's mine. I was too careful, too slow, and he nearly took her from me." A nurse came out moments later to assure them Chimamanda had no internal injuries, just shock and bruises. But the damage was done. Kenneth stood up, clenched his fists, and said with finality, "He touched my daughter. He's finished." That night, Kenneth filed formal charges with every resource he had: child endangerment, assault, attempted kidnapping. He was no longer a grieving widower or a cautious protector. He was a father prepared to destroy anyone who threatened what he loved. By morning, Tchuku's name was all over the news. Video footage captured by a student's phone had gone viral. A man in dark glasses snatching a screaming child outside the school gate, only to be tackled and beaten by bystanders. Parents were outraged, the school faced scrutiny, and Kenneth's name, once shrouded in mystery due to his private lifestyle, became synonymous with protective fatherhood. At the police station, Tchuku sat in cuffs, bruised and arrogant, flanked by two officers. He laughed when Kenneth walked in, until Amaka followed behind. That's when his laughter died. "You really filed it?" he asked, incredulous. Amaka didn't speak. She looked directly at him for the first time without flinching. Her voice, when it came, was steel. "You hit me. You threatened me. You tried to take a child. That's not love. That's a monster in a man's clothing. And I'm done being afraid of you." With Kenneth's lawyer and a female officer present, Amaka filed the final police statement. She detailed every bruise, every locked door, every threat he had ever made. The officer, listening closely, nodded as she scribbled in a thick case file. "This is a pattern," she said, "and it ends today." Amaka submitted the torn photos, the voice messages, the threatening note, and the USB drive. The officer looked stunned as she reviewed it. "You built your case like someone who knew he'd come back," she said. Amaka nodded slowly. "I lived inside his anger. I knew how far he'd go." Kenneth gave his statement next, recounting the events at the hospital and the trauma Chimamanda suffered. When asked if he wished to pursue full charges, he looked the officer squarely in the eye and said, "I want him locked away for a long time. For every woman and child he's ever hurt." The officer scribbled a final note and whispered, "You've got him. And this time he's not walking free." That night, Amaka stayed at Kenneth's home. Not out of fear, but out of trust. Chimamanda, though still shaken, refused to leave her side. She insisted they sleep together in her room. "I'm not scared when you're with me," she said softly. Amaka tucked her in, whispering the same lullabies her mother once sang to her. In the guest room, Kenneth stood by the window, looking out into the dark. He didn't say much, but his silence spoke volumes. When Amaka stepped in, they stood in stillness for a moment before she whispered, "Thank you for fighting for me, for us." He turned and replied, "You saved my daughter twice. This fight was always ours." In the quiet of that moment, a bond deeper than fear, deeper than past pain, solidified. The bond of two survivors, finding something sacred in each other's resilience. And though Tchuku sat behind bars, the war was not just over. But this time, the silence had ended, and justice had finally begun to speak. The courtroom was packed, not with spectators, but with victims. Women who had once been silenced by Tchuku's charm or fists, and families who had watched their daughters crumble under emotional tyranny. Amaka sat beside Kenneth, dressed in a simple navy gown, her natural hair tied in a bun, face calm but resolute. Chimamanda stayed at home, watched over by a trusted school counselor, but her voice lingered in the courtroom through a recorded statement. She had said, "I thought monsters only lived in books, but this one lived in real life, and he tried to take me away from my daddy. He scared me, but I'm not scared anymore." The judge, a stern-faced woman in her early 50s, leaned forward after hearing the playback and said, "Let it be entered into the record that the child's statement holds emotional and psychological weight. Mr. Tchuku is hereby charged with attempted kidnapping, child endangerment, domestic assault, and psychological abuse with intent to harm." Tchuku sat with his head lowered, his lawyer whispering furiously into his ear. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming. The videos, the notes, the testimonies. Amaka testified bravely, her voice clear even when recounting the darkest moments. Kenneth's statement followed, every word deliberate and focused, not just on what was done to his daughter, but on what it represented, a larger pattern of men who thought they could break women to feel powerful. The judge adjourned the case with final words that echoed like thunder through the chamber. Let this court make it clear, no man, no matter how clever, how careful, or how cruel, is above the law. This is not just justice for one child. This is justice for every woman who kept quiet because she was too afraid to speak. Tchuku's bail was denied. As he was escorted out, his eyes met Amaka's. For the first time, she didn't look away. Back at home, Kenneth scooped Chimamanda into his arms and kissed her forehead. "He's gone, Pumpkin," he whispered. "He won't hurt you again." The girl smiled, faintly, and nestled into his shoulder. Amaka stood nearby, her heart full of mixed emotions, relief, grief, and something else she couldn't name. Later that evening, Kenneth lit a candle in his late wife Adora's memory. "Thank you," he whispered into the night air, "for sending her to us." Amaka, standing behind him, finally understood what she had become to him. Not just a teacher or a protector, but a part of his healing. The next chapter of their lives hadn't yet begun. But one thing was certain, they had survived the fire, and now, from the ashes, something new was ready to rise. The courtroom incident closed a devastating chapter, but it also flung open the door to a new one where Amaka and Kenneth no longer walked with fear at their heels. In the days following Tchuku's arrest, Amaka received letters from several women, some anonymous, others brave enough to sign their names, thanking her for speaking out. Some were ex-girlfriends of Tchuku. Others were simply women who had been battered, broken, silenced by men like him. The fact that she had stood her ground and faced him, not just for herself, but for Chimamanda, had become a rallying cry. News outlets picked up the story. Schools began discussions on domestic abuse awareness. But amid all the noise, all Amaka wanted was peace. Not fame, not vengeance, peace. And when she returned to the quiet safety of Kenneth's home, she found it in the most unexpected place, at the dinner table, with Chimamanda giggling over boiled yam and Kenneth gently brushing his daughter's hair away from her eyes. That night, with Chimamanda asleep in her room and the soft hum of crickets outside, Kenneth found Amaka sitting by the veranda, legs curled under her, sipping a cup of tea. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was comforting, shared. Kenneth joined her, no words needed at first. Finally he asked, "Do you feel lighter?" Amaka took a long sip, then replied, "Not lighter. Just less invisible." She turned to him, her voice soft. "I didn't realize how much I'd disappeared inside myself until I heard Chimamanda scream and saw myself in her eyes." Kenneth nodded slowly, eyes glassy. "And you gave her back her voice." "You gave me back mine too, Amaka." For a moment their eyes locked, and everything unsaid stood between them like an unfinished sentence. But they weren't rushing it. This love, if it was truly forming, would be slow, deliberate, and safe. The kind that heals before it claims. The next morning, Amaka officially signed her statement for the District Child Safety and Abuse Committee, agreeing to become a consultant for a school initiative aimed at training teachers to detect and respond to signs of abuse. Kenneth attended the small ceremony where her new role was announced. She was introduced not as a victim, but as a protector, a voice for the voiceless. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on him and Chimamanda sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. After the session, Chimamanda ran up to her and threw her arms around her waist. "You're my hero," the girl whispered. And in that instant, Amaka knew she didn't need medals or headlines. This small voice, this tiny girl who had once been silenced, had given her the only validation she ever needed. No more silence. No more hiding. From now on, her voice would not only be heard, it would echo. The apartment wasn't anything extravagant, 2 bedrooms, white walls, a small balcony with cracked tiles. But to Amaka, it was a kingdom. Kenneth had helped her find it, choosing a quiet estate near Chimamanda School with round-the-clock security and a close-knit community. "It's not charity," he had said with a gentle firmness. "You're not a project. You're family now." The real estate agent had given her the keys, and for a moment Amaka had just stood at the entrance, unable to turn the knob. Her hands trembled as the reality washed over her. This was her place, her door, her freedom. The first night she slept on the mattress on the floor with only a sheet and a pillow, but it was the deepest sleep she'd had in years. No shouting, no broken plates, no locks clicking behind her, just peace, and the faint memory of her younger self whispering, "You made it." As the days passed, Kenneth and Chimamanda visited frequently. They brought curtains, light fixtures, and small home items. One weekend, they painted the living room walls together. Amaka chose warm yellow, a color she'd always loved but never been allowed to use before. Chimamanda left handprints on one corner of the wall in different colors. "That's our signature," she giggled, and Kenneth added his next to hers. Amaka, hesitant at first, added hers too. They stood back and stared at it in silence, a little family forged not by blood, but by resilience and choice. Amaka framed the wall with a wooden border and placed a sofa nearby. "This," she told them, "is my favorite part of the house." Kenneth smiled. "It's ours now. All of it." And in that moment, she felt something stronger than survival. She felt rooted. Finally, she was planting instead of running. That night, Kenneth stayed back while Chimamanda slept on the new couch, curled up under a blanket. Amaka stood on the balcony, watching the stars. Kenneth joined her, handing her a cup of warm tea. "Do you remember," he began slowly, "the first time I saw you cry?" She smiled faintly. "That was the day you became real to me, not just Chimamanda's teacher. You stopped pretending you were okay." Kenneth nodded. "And I think that was the day I fell in love with you." Silence followed. The breeze swept her hair across her cheek. She turned to him, searching his face. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I'm still healing. I'm still learning how to be." He stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that she felt the warmth. "Then let me walk with you while you do. I'm not in a hurry. I'm just here." She smiled through quiet tears. "Then stay." And he did. The school showcase arrived in late April, and Chimamanda had been rehearsing for weeks. Her poem, self-written and deeply personal, was titled The Voice I Found. Amaka helped her prepare, coaching her on pauses, projection, and how to breathe through her nerves. The night of the event, the school hall was filled with parents, students, and staff. Kenneth wore a navy blue kaftan. Amaka wore a deep wine-colored gown. They sat side by side, holding hands under the table as the lights dimmed. One by one, students took the stage. Laughter filled the hall. Then Chimamanda stepped forward. Microphone in hand, she looked out at the audience and began. There was once a time I couldn't speak, when silence wrapped around my throat like a scarf, when smiles were masks and footsteps made me hide. The crowd fell still. Kenneth's eyes welled with tears. Amaka's hand tightened around his. Chimamanda continued. Then a voice came to find me. Not loud but soft. Not thunder but light. And she said, "You matter. You're seen. You're not alone." The applause when she finished was thunderous. Parents stood. Teachers clapped. But Chimamanda's eyes searched only for two people. And when she found them, her father, crying silently, and Amaka, glowing with pride, she smiled the most genuine smile she'd ever worn. After the performance, Kenneth lifted her into his arms. "You were magnificent," he whispered. Chimamanda held his face in her hands and whispered back, "I spoke because she believed in me. And because you did too." Amaka joined them, wrapping them both in an embrace that felt more like home than any place ever had. They didn't need words. They had something better: trust, love, and the bond of survival. Later that evening, they returned to Amaka's apartment to celebrate. There was music, food, laughter. Chimamanda danced in her socks, while Kenneth and Amaka watched, arms around each other. At one point, the little girl paused and turned to them. "So, if you both love each other, does that mean I finally get two parents again?" Kenneth blinked, amused. Amaka blushed. "Would you like that?" he asked. Chimamanda nodded fiercely. "Yes, but only if you both promise never to leave me." Kenneth crouched and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Never. We are home now. All of us." And as they pulled each other into a group hug, the moment wasn't dramatic or ceremonial, but it was everything they had fought for. Peace, safety, love. Not the kind found in fairy tales, but the kind that survives storms and keeps growing anyway. It was a quiet Saturday evening, the sky tinged with soft gold as the sun began its descent beyond the treetops. Kenneth had prepared a small garden gathering in the backyard of his home, the same garden Adora once lovingly tended with Chimamanda by her side. It wasn't grand or overly decorated, just a few lanterns, some flowering shrubs, and a table for three. Chimamanda wore a flowing pink dress, excited but unaware of what was to come. Amaka, dressed in a modest blue gown, arrived a bit flustered, having assumed it was just dinner. Kenneth greeted her with a warm smile, and Chimamanda ran to hug her tightly. They laughed, ate jollof rice and fried plantains, and played soft music from Kenneth's speaker. Then Kenneth rose, walked into the garden bed where Adora once planted lilies, and gently called Amaka over. She followed, puzzled. Chimamanda stayed seated, watching with wide, knowing eyes. Kenneth stood before a wooden arch, recently rebuilt with climbing jasmine vines. He held Amaka's hand and looked at her, not the way people looked when they're about to make a speech, but the way you look at someone when your heart has finally found rest. "Do you remember the first time I came to your school?" he asked. Amaka smiled, nodding slowly. "You looked lost. Not because you didn't know what you were looking for, but because you didn't know how much you needed to find it." He chuckled softly. "I had buried love with Adora. I told myself I'd never feel it again. And then I met the woman who gave my daughter her voice back, who gave me a reason to come home again. You didn't just save Chimamanda, Amaka, you saved me too." She teared up, her hand pressed gently to her lips. "So if you let me," he continued, dropping to one knee, "I want to spend the rest of my life giving you the safety and love you've always deserved. Marry me, Amaka." The air stilled. A single butterfly flitted past, as if even nature paused to witness the moment. Amaka dropped to her knees in front of him, not out of drama, but because her legs could no longer hold the weight of everything that had brought her to this point. Years of silent tears, bruised dignity, locked doors, and unspoken prayers. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Kenneth." He slid the modest but elegant ring onto her finger, and just then Chimamanda ran toward them and wrapped her arms around both of their necks. "Now I have two parents again," she cried. And in that embrace, between a grieving father, a wounded teacher, and a reborn daughter, something extraordinary happened. Three broken hearts found a new rhythm together. Not perfect, not painless, but beautifully whole. The night ended not with fireworks or fanfare, but with laughter echoing through the garden Adora once loved, a sign that love, indeed, can rise from loss. 1 year later, on a bright and wind-swept afternoon in the hills of Enugu, Kenneth and Amaka stood before a small group of family, friends, and former students in an open-air garden wedding. The air smelled of hibiscus and sunshine, with birds chirping as if they were part of the choir. Amaka walked down the aisle, not escorted by a father who had long abandoned her, but by Chimamanda, proudly holding her hand. The girl wore a matching gown and flower crown, walking with the grace of a child who had fought to smile again. Kenneth waited under a flowered arch, his eyes glassy, watching the two most important people in his life walk toward him. The officiant didn't speak for long, just enough to ask the right questions, to which they both answered yes, with voices full of certainty. When the kiss finally came, it wasn't greeted by roaring applause. It was met with soft, tearful smiles, because everyone present knew they were witnessing something sacred. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a promise kept, a war survived. After the ceremony, the reception was intimate and beautiful. Guests danced to old highlife music, ate egusi soup and rice, and shared stories about the bride and groom. Kenneth gave a short speech, and for the first time spoke publicly about Adora. "She was my first home," he said, voice steady. "But sometimes life gives you a second home when the first one is torn away. Amaka is my second home, not because she replaced anything, but because she became the part of my life I didn't know I was missing." Amaka held his hand, eyes brimming with tears. When it was her turn to speak, she looked around the room and said, "I came from a place where I was taught I didn't matter. That love came with conditions. But standing here, I know better now, because love isn't pain. It's safety. It's being believed. It's hearing a child whisper, 'Thank you for staying.'" The crowd stood in a standing ovation. Chimamanda sat between them, eyes shining, the happiest she'd ever been. As the day ended, Kenneth and Amaka danced in the fading sunlight, while Chimamanda twirled nearby with her classmates. The trio posed for photos under the arch, Amaka in her flowing ivory gown, Kenneth in a crisp white agbada, and Chimamanda holding both their hands. In one picture, Amaka leaned down and kissed Chimamanda's forehead, while Kenneth smiled at both of them. That photo would later hang in the center of their living room, the photo of a family not born of blood, but of battle. As the final guests left and the stars came out, Kenneth wrapped his arm around Amaka and whispered, "We made it." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "We did." And as they looked at Chimamanda skipping through the grass, laughter bubbling from her lungs, they knew one truth with complete certainty. They hadn't just survived. They had healed. And from the ashes of pain, they had built a home filled with love, light, and legacy. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.